us our updates and be part of our conversations forum.
Well, I
Friends and fellow Manthanites, frankly, for more than 8 years, Ajay and me have been waiting for this occasion. We've been wanting to have Professor Raghuram Rajan on Manthan. Some of you would remember that we ran a series of discussions on Manthan called Dialogues on Democracy. I fondly remember that the first person we thought, for some reason, we thought that Raghuram Rajan is the person to talk to us about democracy and its connection. And today I'm very, very happy that he's here with us. And Ajay would have been thrilled to bits if he was around. I also thank Dr. Y.V. Reddy, who we call our patron at Manthan, and to have introduced Professor Rajan to us. And he persisted with the idea in the years when we were trying to get him. Frankly, Professor, I wish you were here in person because Manthan is known for its in-person sessions. But thanks to COVID, now online sessions are now par for the course, I guess. Professor Raghuram Rajan needs no introduction. So he's India's youngest governor at RBI. And I would not list today the numerous achievements of the professor, which he achieved in his career as an economist. What I would like to say here is that his speeches on public policy, covering a wide ambit of issues, ranging from the need to safeguard India's liberal values and need to protect it from crony capitalism. I think that is what has garnered and cemented his place as one of the foremost public intellectuals of our time. Perhaps the most important legacy which Professor Rajan carries will be his refreshing habit to ask the big questions and his genuine attempt to answer them as best as he could. This trait alone makes his contribution to India's public discourse immensely valuable. Today, we stand at a moment in our history after independence, and we stand at a time when we have to ask ourselves the important question of the future and the shape Indian democracy is likely to take, the values which we cherish, and the rights which we as democratic citizens need, demand, and would like to have, and integrated with its strong connection with the economic development of the country. We are privileged to have you, sir, to talk on this important topic. And I request all our fellow Manthanites to ponder over the big questions which he is likely to ask, which he always seems to be courageously asking. Thank you for being with us, and it's all yours.
Thank you very much for having me, Dr. Y.V. Reddy, Mr. Vikram, Mr. Reddy, and the distinguished listeners. This is in part a sad occasion because I was speaking earlier with Mr. Ajay Gandhi, and unfortunately, I am able to speak at a time that he's no longer with us. But let me get to the core of what I want to talk about. The topic for my talk today is why liberal democracy is necessary for Indian development. And I'm not a political scientist. Some people say I'm not an economist either, but I certainly have the benefit of seeing political economy play out in policy making in India and across the world. And I want to take on an argument that is often made in India, which is that democracy holds back growth and development, that India needs strong, even authoritarian leadership with few checks and balances on it to progress. And, occasionally it does seem that India is drifting in this direction. I believe this argument is totally misguided because it's based on an outdated model of development. Instead, looking ahead, I would argue our development has to build on our unique aspects in which our liberal democracy and our institutions are going to be critical sources of strength and differentiation. I think if we can build on them, our future is limitless. However, if we allow our democracy to crumble into majoritarianism or authoritarianism, it's not just our economic future that will be jeopardized, but our soul as a nation and our place in the community of nations. So I think democracy is not just something nice to have. I think it is central. And I'm not just talking about the trappings of democracy, the fact that we go and vote every so often. It's also the underpinnings of democracy, the right to speak freely, the presence of strong institutions, checks and balances on authoritarian government. Those are, I think, equally important. Now, with that as preamble, let me start by saying, India has strong growth today, and even the Economist, which is typically critical of India, came out with a reasonably positive view of the possibilities. Now, I think one has to be careful about growth numbers. Any growth obviously should be celebrated, but we can't ignore the fact that the strong growth is from disastrous numbers posted in the last fiscal year. And we also know our poorest citizens, especially our children, have suffered the most during the pandemic and continue to suffer with a K-shaped recovery. The scarring of lower middle class households, the enormous amount of damage done to the informal sector as well as to MSMEs means that the domestic demand that can be generated in our economy will remain subdued after our initial rebound. And we can see that in the numbers. Despite the strong growth, we are still significantly below our pre-pandemic trend line. JP Morgan estimates real GDP is about 6 to 7% below where we would have been without these setbacks. Now, be that as it may, there's another element that we are celebrating. Exports reached 400 billion. Again, good news, but not as good as we sometimes make it out to be, because remember that dollar inflation and prices have grown significantly and have contributed significantly to exports. In fact, JP Morgan warns us about the nominal illusion embedded in looking at these numbers. Dollar inflation has been very high. The inflation in oil prices has been high. And remember, we export a lot of oil. So when you account for all of that, yes, the export performance has been good, not spectacular. Indeed, our imports have grown even faster, so our trade deficit has expanded. So the world over, exports and imports are growing. This is not meant to be a counsel for pessimism, but really a request for realism in assessing our growth performance. We've done creditably, but need to do better. Now, our growth performance is not all the fault of the pandemic. The fact that we've grown more slowly than potentially what we could, that predates the pandemic. Indeed, we've been underperforming ever since the global financial crisis in some ways. And one key measure of this underperformance is that we haven't created the good jobs that our youth need. I mean, the headline number that many of you have read, of course, is that we had 12 million applicants for 35,000 railway jobs. Another aspect of this tragedy is that our youth spend the best years of their lives sitting for exams for government jobs until they become too old to sit anymore. Even more worrisome is we have a scarcity of jobs even when so many of our women are not working outside the house. Our female labor force participation in India is amongst the lowest in the G20 at 20.3% in 2019. Now, the only other country which was in the same league was Saudi Arabia. But even Saudi Arabia has reformed and its female labor force participation is over 33% today. So we underperform pretty much every one of our peers on female labor force participation. Think how much richer we would be as a country, how much less frustrated our youth would be if there were good jobs for all. And so the question we have to ask ourselves, no matter what the GDP growth number, no matter what the export number, why haven't we provided these jobs? Where have we gone wrong? And before I go there, I don't want to be seen only as a pessimist. We have plenty of successes we can celebrate. In the 2 decades after the 1991 reforms, we had 7% average growth, something very few large countries have achieved. And even in the last decade of slow growth, India has had some important successes on exports. We're the world's largest exporter of two-wheeler. We certainly are the largest two-wheeler manufacturer in the world. And we export across the world, including classic Enfields to the country of the Harley Davidson. So we do manage to export even back to the United States, something as intricate as a motorcycle. Within the country, the Aadhaar stack and its applications, such as UPI, are digitizing the daily lives of our citizens. So many fintech startups across India, and UPI has over 4 billion transactions a month now. Of course, success has many fathers, but I do remember we started UPI in 2016 when I was at the RBI. So I claim a little bit of credit for UPI. Of course, much of it was done by NPCI. UPI is now being studied across the world by central banks intending to implement fast retail payments. Of course, in space, we have ISRO, which has put India on the space map at a fraction of the amount spent by other nations. And ISRO is an entirely public sector organization, which has done spectacularly well. And finally, I mean, Indian management is not to be sneezed at. On a good day, two of the most valuable companies in the world, Microsoft and Google, are managed by Indians. So if India and Indians have so much potential, why are we not creating those jobs that we need? I will argue that it's not the fault of our people. Our people, given the right environment, are second to none in the world. I will argue it's a failure of imagination of our politics and our leadership. What has worked for us are well thought through frameworks or infrastructure that free our people to utilize their creativity and enterprise. We don't need the heavy hand of the government, we need the helping hand of the government. So for example, Prime Minister Vajpayee's Golden Quadrilateral Highway, that opened up and connected India. And the rural road projects of subsequent governments builds on that program. So when you see a Pakka road connecting a village to the rest of India, it does wonders for that village economy. Overnight, you see dairy and poultry farming taking off because milk, eggs, and chicken can be transported to markets. Shops start stocking the latest goods. People start getting new jobs within the village, and development occurs before your eyes as people take charge within this new framework. Now, that's an example of utilizing the energy of our people. And the emphasis on hard infrastructure was also supported by efforts to improve schooling and skilling of our workforce, and the steady liberalization of tariffs and regulations to render our economy more competitive. All this was part of a package which was, in addition to this, we also strengthened citizens' control rights over government by acts like the UPA's right to information. And of course, I've already mentioned the other stack, which allowed the state, the private sector, and citizens to do much more digitally. The other stack, the brainchild of Nandan Nilekani. All this led to 7% growth. But the fall off in growth over the last decade raises the question of whether we need to go in an entirely new direction or focus on deepening and broadening reforms. Now, at this point, we should ask, what is the government's vision? And the present government's vision seems to center around the word Atmanirbhar, or self-reliance. In some ways, this is a continuation of the recent past. In its last budget, the government emphasized better connectivity and logistics and devotes significant resources to it. That's part of the framework of enabling people to access both an all India market as well as a global market. That is indeed very good. Yet in some ways, Atmanirbhar seems to be a reversion to a more distant and failed past, where we focused on physical capital and goods, not human capital and services, on protection and subsidies, not on liberalization and competition. Let me explain. First, on the relative focus of our spending. As you know, there's a tragedy that is overtaking our school children, especially the poor ones. Many, not having been to school for 2 years, are not just 2 years behind, they've also forgotten what they learned in the past. and are many years behind. It requires enormous effort to bring these children back to where they were if not, accelerating their learning. And we need lots of resources devoted to this. Unfortunately, there are very few state governments which are taking this up as a mission. And the central government is emphasizing digital resources, which many of these kids don't have, rather than actually bringing these kids back to school and to the level of learning that they need. I mean, one example of a state which is doing something is Tamil Nadu, which has come up with an innovative scheme, Ilam Thedi Kalvi, to hire 1.75 local workers in an attempt to offer children remedial learning and draw them back to school. But even that program is discovering that over 5 lakh children have dropped out and have to be coaxed back. Now, I don't think Tamil Nadu is the worst affected state, but many states are doing little, perhaps because such schemes cost money. And this would be a place where the central government could both provide support as well as guidance. Instead, the central government is devoting resources to something else. $30 billion are being devoted to what are called production subsidies to big manufacturing industry. Of course, not all in the same year, over time, but let me just talk a little bit about the PLI scheme. This clearly is an emphasis on an attempt to create jobs. And this follows a pattern of a country that has done really well. China. I said earlier India had grown strongly, but China has grown even more strongly. As recently as 1995, China and India were neck to neck in per capita GDP. The numbers today are staggeringly different. 17,200 for China at purchasing power parity and 6,300 for India. And of course, at market exchange rates, it's even wider. Now, certainly China, therefore, is an example that we want to look at. And, it appears as if we want to replicate China's success in manufacturing. This is certainly an important vision. Question is the China path feasible? And immediately you see that Chinese growth was initially achieved by suppressing wages and consumption and keeping borrowing costs in check by lowering the interest paid to households. And that allowed the country to essentially provide cheap inputs to firms, and therefore firms could then produce, including for exports. And all this was possible because China was an authoritarian government. It could tell the banks, thou shalt not lend, thou shalt not pay depositors more than thus and such interest rate. It could tell the households, it could tell the unions, don't ask for higher wages. And that worked. It worked because the firms grew and wages grew over time simply because of the tremendous growth rate in China. And in the process, China created a more educated workforce, a decent infrastructure, and reduced tariffs. Now, our starting point is different. It is impossible at this point, and also undesirable, for India to directly suppress worker wages or reduce the rate it pays households on the deposits, the investment it makes in the financial sector. So if we can't do that, what alternatives are there for the government? Certainly improving the business environment through better logistics, as for example in this budget, and reducing some of the regulatory overhead, that is a way to go, and that is being done. But there's another path, which is raise tariffs, increase the protection for our industry, and offer production subsidies for large manufacturers. Now, this is a path in which, for example, let's take cell phones. In 2017 and 2018, tariffs were raised from 10% to 20% of the output price. In addition, in 2020, production-linked incentives were offered to this industry. In short, 6% of the invoice price of your cell phone will be rebated to the industry if you expand production in India. Okay, so this combination, I increase the tariffs 20%, that gives protection, and I subsidize the production 6%. And remember, it's the total production which is subsidized, not the value added in India. That is an attempt to, in a sense, adjust for the competitive disadvantage that India faces on account, as the ministry says, of the lack of adequate infrastructure, high cost of finance, unavailability of quality power, limited design capabilities, inadequacy in worker skills. This is all from the Ministry of Electronics website. So the government argues industry needs tariff protection and subsidies, and then it will produce. And of course, industry is very happy hearing this. It's willing to take. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, who pays for this? Clearly, consumers pay at least 20% more than the international market price because of tariffs, and this boosts the margin of producing in India. In addition, the national taxpayer pays 6% in production subsidies. Typically, the value added in a cell phone is 20 to 25%, even at maximum production. Remember, you import the chip, you import the circuit board, etc. Put differently, the production subsidy is a quarter to 1/3 of the value added. Add that to the tariff protection, and add to that the fact that states add power subsidies, land subsidies, and capital expenditure subsidies. In fact, this is again something that is touted as some of the benefits. Put differently, there's an enormous amount of protection and subsidy being given today to cell phone manufacturing in India. And the question is, who's paying for it? Almost surely the citizen. And one example of this, I just asked my RA to pull out some prices. The iPhone 13 Pro Max is available for 90,366 rupees in Chicago today, inclusive of taxes, based on the current prevailing exchange rate. It is available for 129,000 rupees in India today, which is a markup of 43% over the international price. Now, the iPhone is something that is internationally traded. That tells me the domestic citizen is paying a lot for the privilege of having cell phones manufactured in India. Now, maybe it's worthwhile if we create a cell phone industry in India which matches the world's cost. But the key then is whether our manufacturers become more efficient over time so we can remove the protection and subsidies, or will they stay inefficient and lobby for continued subsidies? And the lesson from the license permit Raj was it's the latter. We tried this before and failed because our industry was never willing to forego protection. And already we are seeing firms lobbying for the PLI scheme to be extended to compensate for the pandemic period. In other words, don't tell me how much is being produced by the PLI scheme. Tell me how much we are paying for the privilege of having manufacturing in India, and whether in the long run, this is going to be competitive. If at the time you withdraw some of these subsidies, and remember the state subsidies are over 10, 12 years as they're trying to attract manufacturers. If you withdraw them, if production is not competitive, then we're back to square one. There are other sort of reasons why tariffs are not a good way to increase sort of production. What most economists will tell you is a tariff on inputs is a tax on exports. And the argument is, let me put a tariff on steel. Obviously, my steel producer is benefited, but then my car production becomes uncompetitive because now car producers in India have to pay a much higher price for steel. So tariffs keep sort of aggregating and make other parts of the economy unproductive. The car industry then demands protection. So this constant demand for protection tends to increase. And of course, if you keep moving some tariffs up, other tariffs down in order to respond to whatever manufacturer is raising the loudest voice, basically no manufacturer has a sense of certainty about how costs will vary over time. Any global manufacturer fears that export-oriented investment could be disrupted by some well-connected domestic lobby wrangling a tariff on inputs. The point I'm trying to make is that this tariffs and subsidy route has been followed before. I can understand there's a new idea this time. If we get enough scale, maybe we become internationally competitive. Maybe, but we have to fix logistics, we have to fix the skill base, et cetera, et cetera. Even if we maybe we can do all that. I want to be open to that. But in the meantime, we are locked into a permanent pattern of subsidizing our biggest firms. Importantly, we are ignoring other pressing concerns. Because, for example, as we are spending money on the PLI scheme, we're not paying enough attention to schooling in the budget, and schooling may be more important. Last point, and then I'll move to the alternative. The last point on this export-led manufacturing growth based on tariffs and subsidies is the worry that even if we are successful, even if we do become an export powerhouse, there are limits to how much we can grow there, simply because China has already muddied the waters. Developed countries are today very reluctant to accept another China storming its way into domestic markets and decimating the small town manufacturers that still survive. So we will see a political reaction also if we are successful. Now, what is the alternative? What is the alternative if we need to export to world markets in order to create the jobs, at least some of the jobs that we need? And I would argue there's an obvious alternative, which builds on the old vision of increasing openness and liberalization, but also draws on India's people, their minds, their creativity, and also our liberal democracy. It does cater to demand in the much larger global market, thus allowing India to get rich fast by producing for others. But instead of focusing on exporting goods, let's focus on improving the export of services, where we already have a strong presence and some learned advantages. Now, obviously, people immediately ask, why not do both? You don't have to do either or. And certainly, I'm not calling for abandoning manufacturing. We should continue to build out infrastructure. We should make the production environment, the business environment more liberal, encourage our manufacturers to seek out new global markets. But we shouldn't do it through protective tariffs and subsidies. Instead, let's remedy the deficiencies that the ministry lists on its website. But also, we need to figure out where we're going to spend. Are we going to spend $30 billion on production-linked subsidies? Or are we going to spend $30 billion on schools, on medical clinics, on colleges that will improve the human capital of our people? Put differently, are we going to focus on goods and things or minds and ideas? And that, in a sense, is the choice we have to make. We don't have to certainly shut down manufacturing. I hope we go to bigger and greater heights. But I would say if we're going to spend on subsidies, think of whether we want to subsidize education or subsidize manufacturing. And I would argue time and again, the answer has to be education. Let me explain why the environment has changed to favor service exports in the last few minutes. The pandemic has made it easy to provide high value-added services at a distance. If my niece can work from home in Bangalore to service clients in Mumbai in consulting, she can very well service clients in Chicago. If markets for services like consulting, legal and financial advisory, education, and telemedicine, these are all available now globally. And services can be delivered online, largely online, unlike physical goods. And services delivered online don't cross a physical border where they can be stopped. Moreover, the United States and Europe are the largest exporters of services. And they have to also worry if they start becoming protectionist there about a tit for tat in other countries. They have, in a sense, an incentive to become more open on services if they are pushed. But there's another advantage India has here. It's liberal democracy. A key element in many of these new services is shared values and trust, especially around the data that are harvested. This immediately puts a number of authoritarian countries like China and Russia at a disadvantage. No customer cares where they're buying a vacuum cleaner from so long as it works, because once it's sold, that's it. But if they ask to share their medical or financial data or their firm's strategy, they care very much. Will the provider protect their data? Will the provider's government snoop or use the data to blackmail? It helps if the provider comes from a transparent and tolerant democracy that is driven by rule of law, where the judicial system allows redress against problems. So that's one reason why we are specially advantaged on services. Another reason is we already have a good reputation. Indians the world over are known for services. In the US, everyone has a good doctor of Indian origin. Many CEOs have had good consultants of Indian origin. And as I said, some CEOs in the tech sector are already of Indian origin. The Indian diaspora has done India proud. And of course, the image of our software engineers working out of India, put that together with the outsourcing industry, we already have a respectable brand image. And if we have strengthened democratic credentials, our ability to compete is strengthened even further amongst emerging nations. Last reason for why, if we were to weight manufacturing versus services, we should put more weight on services, is the fact that the world is growing green. It will be impossible for the world to grow its consumption of goods at the pace of the past. More of the consumption basket will increasingly consist of services, even for moderate income countries. So if we're looking ahead, decades ahead, it certainly makes sense to lay more of our eggs in the service basket. Let me, in the last few minutes, raise two questions. The immediate question is, will high quality service jobs provide jobs for the rest? Where are the jobs going to come from? After all, I started this whole discussion saying we need more jobs. And second, what do we need to do differently other than reorient our spending towards areas that are more service-oriented? So let's start with the first question. Will services provide enough jobs? Now, let me emphasize, I'm not saying let's close down manufacturing. I'm not saying let's close down construction, which is actually an important service. Many countries have grown on the basis of a strong construction sector, and India should be no exception. Jobs here will continue to grow. What I am talking about is new thrust areas. If we're talking about new thrust areas, let's not put all our money into trying to create manufacturing, but let's put some money into trying to create services. For example, one service sector is education itself. In many high-skilled services, only the lack of a recognized degree and trust stops our people from serving the world. So quality higher education is a must, both to provide that degree to many of our own youth, but also as a service we can provide to the youth of the world. With more high-quality universities and technical institutes, we can attract students from our neighbors, from Africa, from the Middle East, from Southeast Asia to begin with. This is something that Australia is doing. Why can't we do as well as Australia? Because many of the professors in Australian universities, you will recognize, are of Indian origin. If these students come to India and have a good experience, they become our ambassadors, just like our diaspora, and we build networks around the world. We can also deliver education into people's homes directly from India. EdTech is, as you know, increasing by leaps and bounds. And EdTech in India can create many jobs, not just for the software programmers and the educationists who help them, but also for software-assisted tutors. Man and machine together make a much better combination. And this is something EdTech has shown. Now, every good skilled job creates 4 or 5 jobs for the less skilled. Every school, university, or EdTech platform not only creates jobs for teachers and tutors, but also jobs for clerical staff, coaches, cooks, cleaners, ground staff, security guards. Now, these are not great jobs, but they're jobs. And they're better jobs than those that are available in agriculture today. Our ambition should be to make everyone capable of getting the good jobs while automating the hard, unskilled ones, but there will be a transition. In general, getting people a reasonable job can be the way to transit their families to much higher levels of education. At the RBI, I remember we used to have regular once a year meetings with the families of all our staff. And when you met the families of the class 4 clerical staff, these are, in a sense, at the bottom of the RBI hierarchy. These were people who didn't have much of an education themselves. Peons, for the most part, drivers, some of them. But when you looked at their children, they had made an enormous leap. Many of them were bank managers, some working in Infosys, some working even in consulting, because they had got an education. And these are the possibilities of leapfrogging if you can get the right kind of education to people who have modest salaries, to their children, bringing their families up through employment possibilities. And of course, these kinds of possibilities can multiply when you think of medicine, fintech, consultancy, legal services, as also more traditional services like travel and tourism. So the bottom line is, I'm arguing we can be the first nation that transitions directly to services without going fully through manufacturing, which then means the premature deindustrialization that Danny Roderick worries about will not be a bug for India, but a feature of our growth path. That is something we can think about. Let me end with saying, is this easy? Is this going to be relatively easy? A service path requires us to have many more people with high quality capabilities. So we have to invest in people. We have to put people first. So that's number one in a service-oriented program. Second, we require a government that is more pragmatic, transparent, decentralized, and open to challenge, because it requires the government to do things that no government has done before. Take a developing country from following the export-led manufacturing path, but instead follow the service-led path. That is a lot of learning. A lot of new stuff has to be done. For that, we need a learning government. So number two is we need a learning government. Number three, the world has to be made much more hospitable to trade in services. I don't want to give the impression that services are open. It's going to be easy selling services across the world. Services have been historically protected, for example, by licensing requirements. But across the world, there is now a desire, an appetite for change. Licensing requirements, even within the United States, are being seen as protectionist within the United States, keeping certain sectors from competition. And therefore, there is an appetite for change. India could lead global change there. Let me just emphasize these 3 points very quickly and then close. Putting people first. We have to give everyone a chance, starting from our biggest minority, women, including religious minorities like Muslims, and disadvantaged castes and tribes. In this day and age, a discriminatory society is not just immoral, it is weak because it's internally divided, and it has few friends in the community of democracies. If other democracies are our target markets, we cannot be seen as creating second-class citizens of our minorities. For instance, nothing has riled the Western media and society more about China, prompting sanctions and boycotts, than its treatment of Uyghurs. So this is important to keep in mind. We have a good reputation. It is ours to lose if we become discriminatory against minorities, whether they be women or Muslims. Second, people, even the very poor, know what's best for them. We must empower them to seek out better futures for their children. And the government's push for direct cash transfers, I think, is a step in the right direction. But it is also important to see every part of our support system works towards empowering people and getting them to the right place. For example, Tamil Nadu has moved from providing gold ornaments for girls as they, in an attempt to, fund part of their marriage, but instead moving that money to funding their university education. That, I think, is a step in the right direction, empowering women with additional skills rather than necessarily incentivizing them into the marriage market. I'm not saying marriage is a bad thing. I'm just saying that if you wanted to provide support from the government's perspective, providing support for education seems the right thing. Now, it's also important the government be responsive to local needs. One remedy is, of course, to decentralize government, which I'll come to in a second. The second is to place much greater weight on individual rights and freedoms and push courts to enforce them. One of the biggest forces that corrects government misbehavior is criticism from the people who are being governed. If you can suppress those critics by draconian acts like UAPA and the sedition law, basically you protect the government against criticism and protect it from change, which often is terrible for the people being governed. So we need to make government more responsive to criticism by removing some of the legislative constraints on criticism. Finally, putting people first means the government has to make better spending choices. Let me give an example. If you're going to spend 10 billion on chips, that would be the manufacturing-led exports route. The human capital route would be to spend 10 billion on top universities. I mean, as an example, or on top schools. If you spend $10 billion, we can get 100 top quality new universities or 10,000 well-equipped schools. Now, those 100 top quality universities can produce, 10,000, let's say, top quality engineers, or maybe even 100,000 top quality engineers. Those 100,000 top quality engineers can produce far more intellectual output, far more chip design, far more software than the 10 billion you will invest in hardware. Put differently, if we have limited budgets and have to choose between services and manufacturing, should we aim to create a Qualcomm or a Broadcom which designs chips rather than a TSMC which manufactures them? My sense, if you look at even just market valuations, you'll choose the former. But that requires a sea change in our spending priorities. Last 2 points, we need a learning government. In order for government to learn, it has to know what the data are. We should stop suppressing data, whether it's data on unemployment or data on deaths from COVID. We need data to make the right decisions. We also need to protect free speech and criticism so that our critics can tell us when we're going wrong. We also need broader government so that government is not taken by a small coterie based on very limited information and views, but arrived at through debate in parliament, in government, in cabinet, and in various fora. We also need decentralization. More decentralization means you're closer to the people that are being governed, you're closer to the local problems, you're closer to local solutions, and you can do many experiments which will get you a sense of what works locally. And finally, and I'm going to end here, we need to lead global change. Service exports requires change elsewhere. For example, telemedicine requires our medical degrees to be recognized in the UK, in the United States. Also, telemedicine would be easier if Medicare, Medicaid, and the National Health Service paid for treatment provided from India. Now, this is not going to happen overnight. We need to change our negotiating stance on international agreements. If they want access to Indian markets, we have to say, yes, we're happy to do that, but we want access to your markets, not just for goods, but also for services. India could use its G20 presidency to shift the world to debating these issues. So let me end by saying, I'm calling for an Indian growth path that draws on Indian capabilities, builds on India's strength of tolerance and respect for all, and makes, builds on the fact that most people have an idea of India that they love across the world. This path would build on India's unique democracy, not just treat it as something nice to have, but something essential, and go beyond the fact that we have regular elections, but that the argumentative the argumentative Indian can debate and criticize, that we can have ideas that are diametrically opposite to the government's. And in that way, through debate, we achieve a consensus which improves the quality of our governance and makes our government much more trusted by citizens, not just in India, but across the world. Bottom line, I'm calling for India to become a Vishwa Guru, not just based on the ideas of the past, but because it has a new vision of green, inclusive, local-led growth and development, and persuades the world of its vision. That's 45 minutes. That's what I promised. Happy to go to questions.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Raghuram Rajan. Actually, you've given us 46 minutes, a little more, a minute longer. You have really covered a huge canvas, as I say, on the current economic situation, a future growth path, and the kind of things that we need to do in our democracy. Let me start with a specific question. I mean, you said that your suggestions are to put people first. And there you place a huge role for education. And then you make this ambitious statement that let us be the first developing country to transform itself through services. Now, if I could ask, I mean, it's not meant to be provocative for the sake of being provocative, but if I could say that, look, if we miss the industrial revolution, given the transformation that artificial intelligence, large language learning models are bringing about, have we also missed the service revolution, in the sense that the kind of jobs that we can do through services are going to be very rapidly automated, like, the talk about radiologists becoming redundant in a few years' time. I know the arguments for AI that it will also create more jobs, but that seems to be the case more for the advanced countries. So is there a service path, or is that rapidly closing? I mean, this is not to deny that education, high quality universities are all ends in themselves. They don't have to be instrumental. But the services route as well, is it closing? Has it closed? Or should we, since we are going into the unknown, should we just continue that path?
I mean, machines are entering everywhere, right? Take chip manufacturing. How much labor do you think it's going to employ? Very, very little, right? This high-tech manufacturing is in a sense what we have to set our standards against. That said, I think across the world, we are discovering the hype associated with AI is also extreme. There is a sense that, we typically claim we will achieve things which actually take decades to achieve. So I think there is time before many of these jobs. I mean, radiologists aren't going away. Yes, they're being helped by AI. It allows them to, in a sense, if they use AI, it is to try and make their jobs easier so that they can focus on the exceptions rather than focus on the routine. And that's typically where, these new aids come in. Yes, there are some jobs that they will totally displace, but almost always man plus machine or woman plus machine is better than machine alone or woman alone. And that's what we're seeing again and again. So I think there is still a runway ahead. But I think you point out that it's not going to be there forever. And so if we need to seize it, we need to seize it now. And I mean, take, for example, higher education. I mean, you see across the world, there's immense competition now to try and, everywhere I go in India, I see big billboards, come to Monash University, come to this university, come to that university. It is something which we can seize very easily if we focus on doing that. And there are many other areas like that. But that then gives us a pathway by creating the right human capital to also seize other sectors of the service sector, but also manufacturing, skilled manufacturing, the design engineers who go into chip manufacturing. We can do that.
Professor Rajan, I would argue that one point which you mentioned, which I really like, is that the poor know what is best for them. Is this something which we have missed by assuming that the poor do not know what is good for them, and we have to tell them what needs to be done? Especially, I think the poor know what is best for them, and that is consistent with a liberal democracy.
Yeah.
Why are we why are we not why are we not trusting our poor?
I think we are increasingly trusting them, but the way to do it is by giving them more opportunity to make decisions. And one place where I think we're doing this quite well is in direct benefits transfers. One of my students, for example, is working on the money that went to farmers, the 6,000 rupees, and is finding that it enabled them to actually make capital investments, which increased their incomes, the productivity of their farms. They didn't just spend it on, willfully. That's always a fear that, somehow if you make direct benefits transfers, they will just fritter it away. And instead, study after study suggests they make serious, careful decisions based on what they need. And so I think this move towards direct benefit transfers in many parts of the economy is a step in the right direction. It gives the poor more agency and allows them to deal with the problems that they face rather than what the problems the government thinks they have. And I think, the government has to be credited for it.
You're muted, Ram.
Sorry. There are a number of questions which viewers have asked, so we can just give you a sample of them. One of the first is by Mr. Rangarao, who asked a familiar question that about China versus India, that how an authoritarian China has achieved phenomenal economic growth, much more than a democratic India. So how does a liberal democracy in India be a better bet? If I can add to that, this whole question of democracy versus growth, been discussed over decades, and people point to East Asia in the 60s and 70s, whether in South Korea or even Malaysia, there was limited democracy, and yet economic development was achieved. Now, again, yes, democracy in itself is to be highly valued, as Professor Mathiasen has mentioned, but is this a false, opposition of democracy versus development?
No, I think it worked well for the times. First, let me say the comparisons between China and India never take into account the fact that China had a much better educated population at any point in time relative to India. They, whether it's the Marxist system or whatever, they managed to do a better job on education. And so that's to be kept in mind, because if you have more education, you have a workforce which is more capable of doing manufacturing jobs, et cetera, et cetera. We caught up to some extent, but that was largely after liberalization in the 1990s. Before that, there was not a strong sense that our people needed much more education. And that was a big difference, something that Yasheng Huang of MIT keeps pointing out as the difference between India and China. But that said, I would also argue that an authoritarian structure works better for the early stages of manufacturing. If you want to build infrastructure, the basic infrastructure that you need, if you want to suppress worker wages in order to give firms a chance without wasting huge subsidies on them, if you want to give firms cheap credit, all this, it helps to have an authoritarian structure which basically says, thou shalt do what I say. How easy is it in China building high-speed rail? Simply because land can be appropriated by the government without any questions asked. That same high-speed rail between Mumbai and Ahmedabad, we mooted it, I think 2017, 2018. It looks likely to be finished only by 2028. That's in that span, China would have made many, thousands of miles of high-speed rail. That is not to criticize Indian democracy. It is to say that we have to work within its confines. But in some sense, see it not as only a constraint, but also as a support, as something that can make us do other things better. And so that's where I'm saying that an authoritarian system advantages manufacturing to some extent, but not high-skilled manufacturing, low-skilled assembly line manufacturing. High-skilled manufacturing and services, I think, requires something more akin to what we have: democracy, debate, discussion. You can see what is happening in China to private industry today when the Communist Party says, thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that. And you're seeing a breakdown of the Chinese private sector because of what the government is doing. That is the cost of authoritarianism. And my sense is, if we play our cards right, there are many gaps that we can fill that will take us to much stronger levels of growth rather than trying to follow in their footsteps. Now, when I say this, people say, oh, we're not trying to follow in China's footsteps. But, a manufacturing-led growth path is precisely what East Asia, especially China, did.
The other question which is there here is that then have you also compromised on the independence of these institutions? That is crucial to economic development. Are the architecture of our public institutions, are they flawed, that they can be compromised, and that's what's being exploited now? Judiciary, election commission, Reserve Bank.
I am not a political scientist, but certainly when you read the early constitutional debates, you get the sense that our founders, especially the ones who wrote the Constitution, wanted to be very respectful of the government. To some extent, the government was elected. The government had stalwarts at that time who had fought the freedom struggle. And there was a sense that, the good intentions of government were enough. And so we didn't create strong institutions. There were big debates about fundamental rights in the early years. And whenever there was a sort of decision, typically the courts came down in favor of the government, to protect the ability of the government to do what it needed to do. And I think over the years, that sort of initial structure has sort of stayed with us. And therefore, the checks and balances on the government, the independent institutions within the government itself, those have become eroded. Now, that said, I think every once in a while, somebody takes charge of one of those institutions and sort of tries to create more independence for it. Classic example is T.N. Seshan and the Election Commission. Without T.N. Seshan, I think we would be in a much worse position. He created a strong election commission, which then his successors built on. And therefore, we are in a much better place today. Similarly, I can point to a long string of RBI governors in the past who created the kind of independence that helped the RBI, for a long time, stay as an independent entity. I think that it would have been better if we had more skepticism about the good intentions of government, but it would have made government harder. And, with the limited capabilities that we had in government then and now, you can't sort of put too many constraints. But as we develop, I think we need to put more constraints because we need a government which is not unconstrained, which listens, which is checked in some of its worst instincts. And to see what unconstrained government can do in terms of damage, you just have to look to some of our neighbors and understand that's a problem.
Dr. Rajan, if I can, there are two questions specifically on democracy, if I can relay them. One is from Mr. Avik Jayant, who asks, India clearly lacks a substantial intellectual elite who would pitch for political accountability. Would you have something to say on that? The second, related but more specific, from an Ishani Karimgulla, who asks, what's happening in India today is the antithesis of liberal democracy, homogenizing everything into a Hindu Rashtra. What is the price India will pay in future in economic terms? I wonder if you'd like to take these two questions together.
So remind me, the first question again was
about the intellectual elite. Do we have an intellectual elite which will push for accountability here?
Okay, let me take the majoritarianism issue first. I think our trend towards majoritarianism has enormous consequences, all of them adverse, and I would resist that. I think it is against the notion of India that our founding fathers had. It is against every economic principle. You don't waste human capital by treating it as second class. And by this, I mean both women as well as our large minorities, as well as our scheduled caste, scheduled tribes. We need inclusive growth. And you don't get inclusive growth by treating any segment of your population as second class citizens. But also in this world, which is so hyper-connected, everything that we do is on the world's newspaper headlines and on social media within a span of minutes. Everybody knows what is happening in India today. And, this doesn't necessarily win us friends. Of course, it wins us friends amongst some other majoritarian groups. But remember, each majoritarian group has its own idea of who should be privileged. The white majoritarians in the US don't necessarily make common cause with the Hindu majoritarians in India, even though sometimes they feel, there's some commonality. Absolutely not. They despise each other. So in that sense, I think that majoritarianism is divisive. It is wasteful of human resources. It divides India at a time India has to stay together, given the external threats that we face. It will weaken India, and it should be strongly, strongly opposed. That is not to say that we should not have a push towards, a broader citizenship, a common understanding of what it means to be a citizen, a general sense of what citizen responsibilities are, etc. I think we all need to work towards that. I would even say over time, it would be good to have a uniform civil code, not based on forcing one community's civil code on others, but instead communities themselves seeing the need for reform within their communities and developing a consensus on where they would like to go. I mean, all those things I think are certainly feasible and necessary. But I think the way we see majoritarianism playing out, in a sense, is extremely dangerous for the future of India. And I think it should be resisted at every step. On the issue of intellectual elite, I think it's not so much the elite. I see plenty of people raising a voice against what is happening. It is the fora in which they can speak, the ability to reach wider audiences without having your voice drowned by the naysayers. And this is where a free press is extremely important. Unfortunately, the press in many emerging markets is driven by the need for government advertisements, for government support. And that itself, without any official censorship, can be a way of limiting the voices that are naysayers, that are critics. And I think that, we have to deal with that. We have to work to fight that tendency within our country. I'm glad to say that there are a number of outlets on social media which are taking up the responsibility of providing strong, good journalism. And I think they will, apart from the continuing voices amongst our newspapers, of which there are some, I think they will stand India in good stead.
Our member of the Manthan board, Sujata Rao, asked a question. Is privatizing education at private universities the way to go? What is the lesson from the US? I mean, if you take the example of Scandinavian countries where all education, up to higher education, is funded by the government, is that the way to go? Because you also are now advocating that if there is a choice, you would rather put $10 billion into education. By that, I assume that you would route this money through government-funded institutions. Is that the argument, or the argument that we are for private?
I have never been persuaded that it's only ownership that matters. In other words, in my sort of views as a regulator, I've never sort of felt that public sector banks are a bad thing or private sector banks are necessarily good. I think each one has its strengths, and properly managed, a mixed setting can often be very good because each one then caters to their strengths. Public sector banks can be a source of stability in bad times as people fear what might happen to the private banks. On the other hand, private banks can be a source of innovation, which sometimes the public sector banks are more reluctant to provide. So similarly, I think it's wrong to say one form of university dominates the others. I think there's room for both, and India needs plenty of universities, whether private universities or public universities. But we need high quality universities. And therefore, we have to focus on how the product is delivered. That, in fact, we are emphasizing quality. I mean, I come from two public universities, right? The IIT and the IIM, funded by taxpayer money, paid for by the government. And I don't think I've suffered as a result. So I think quality matters, whether it's delivered from the public university or the private university. Our public universities do need support. But I think we also have room for private universities which can be funded through philanthropic effort. In fact, I'm involved with one such university, Kriya University in the South. And so far, so good.
Once again, you're muted, Ram.
I know, sorry. There's a question from Mr. Sanjay Jasrani. I mean, you addressed this, but maybe you could use this question to elaborate on the services and route. He asks, dignified blue-collar jobs with decent pay levels are a key channel for large-scale social mobility. How can you ignore this?
I'm not ignoring it. I'm saying that we will be able to create more of those. As I said, those are disappearing from manufacturing. Your capital-intensive manufacturing is not going to use too many workers. See how many workers are in even, take Bajaj's scooter plant. See how many manufacturing workers there are, and you will see they're a fraction of what they were earlier. So this is to your point, Ram, that you made earlier, that automation is reducing middle-class jobs. That said, services also provides a ton of blue-collar employment. Take, for example, the tourism sector, which is an important part of the service sector that we hope to encourage. That tourism sector will provide jobs as hotel managers. It'll provide jobs as chefs, cooks, waiters, a whole set of jobs which require the range of skills from relatively unskilled to very skilled. Similarly, even jobs catering to the upper middle class households that we will have many more of if we go into high quality services. Yes, today one of the fastest growing job categories in India is security guard. Totally unskilled, but probably provides more pay than that person would have in the village as their land holdings diminish. And so, yes, there is a transition process. hopefully the security guard themselves move up as they learn on the job, as they learn within the establishment. But certainly their children will hopefully move to the upper layers of society. We can make that transition in a generation. As I said or attempted to say in the example, we can see that happening before our eyes. And it's something that has to be encouraged. It's something that can happen with services, with education.
Actually, there's a question here from Sanjay again. It's a simple question. Is India doing anything right at all?
Of course. And so this is the, I hate to say this, but this is the cynical interpretation of what I'm trying to say, which is, look, I'm trying to say there are lots of things we're doing right, but we're not doing enough. I've always been saying that. We can do more, we can do better. Let's not be complacent and say we're doing everything we need to. And what I'm saying is, let's not put all our eggs in this manufacturing basket, which we've tried before, and which involves an enormous amount of subsidy and tariffs, which are being paid for by our customers. If you take the entire bill, and I'd love somebody to do a study on this PLI scheme, a close study, what exactly are we getting? What exactly are we paying before we start spreading it across the board? What's the alternative? Let's ask what the alternative is and see whether we can do some of those things better, right? And so when I say there are ways we can do things better, it's not saying that we're not doing anything good. It's saying that we can find places. We're not, I mean, what I'm railing against is this tendency to thump our chest and say, we're the greatest, we're the most wonderful country in the world, we're doing as well as we could. I mean, come on, just be realistic. Don't buy all the propaganda that you see and understand what is going wrong. And I just pointed to one place, jobs, where we can do far better. Now, again, it's not that we're doing nothing, but when you look at the levels of unemployment, you look at the levels of anger, you have to admit we have to do better here.
Dr. Rajan, there are a number of questions on higher education from Sujata and others. I just paraphrase a couple of them. One is whether you're really advocating foreign universities to come up and set up shop. The other is from Sujata that privatization of education also means increasing fees. Look at what's happening in medical colleges, and look also at what has happened in the US, where high fees has led to high debt, and that's caused burden on students and families. So is that the way to go? I mean,
no, look, if you pose it that way, obviously not. The problem in the US is with this private for-fee college. We're not talking about the Yale universities or Harvard University. We're talking about colleges, no-name colleges, which have been set up precisely to milk the student of money and then leave them with an education which gets them nowhere, right? So the for-profit sort of fly-by-night operator, and we have plenty of those in India also, as your questioner correctly recognizes. And that means that there is no substitute for regulation. We do need to regulate, but not so much to privilege entry to the capitation fee colleges owned by politicians, but instead open it out to high quality institutions wherever they may come from, whether they're government institutions or whether they're private institutions. And that means a good accreditation system, a honest and non-corrupt accreditation system, and a way of weeding out the fly-by-night operators who set up only to part students of their hard-earned money, okay? So does this mean privatization? No, it doesn't. Does it mean having a mixed economy? Yes. It means don't distrust the private sector. It may actually sometimes provide higher quality. But you have to verify that it is providing higher quality. You have to have a proper accreditation system. You have to see that the students have adequate facilities and so on. That's the process of regulation. So my sense is you can do both. You can have the public sector system and you can have a private sector system and let them compete with each other. And that will be beneficial to the ultimate consumer, which is the student.
Vikram.
Friends, I think we are now at the end of this thing, and thank you, Professor Rajan, for being with us. As expected, you've asked us many questions. You asked always the big questions, and I think it will take a lot of time from all of us to think about these questions. We thank you for being here with us. Once again, we thank Dr. Reddy for getting you here. And we wish you come to Hyderabad and visit us in person. That's a different experience, I must tell you. And please do come back and come to Hyderabad to visit us. And thank you for being with us on Manthan today.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Friends,
Dr.
our
Rajan.
next
Thank you
event
very
will be on June 13th. We have Vrinda Grover. We take a long break between today and Vrinda Grover. That'll be on June 13th. Thank you, everyone, for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Professor Rajan, for making time, as I keep saying, on a Saturday morning.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.